Well, thank you for sharing what your name means. Continue to share and share with others as we go to morning tea when we get there. Nehemiah's name means Yahweh has comforted. Yahweh has comforted. God has comforted. Now, the Grossi families, they have a few Yahs in their grandkids' names, and you can ask them about that. But Yahweh has comforted. Very fitting for Nehemiah because his name, when we meet him in chapter 1, he's in mourning, he's in weeping. That is because the Jewish people have been exiled, and he has been exiled, and he has been taken away 900 kilometers away to Babylon, and he's been disconnected from country, from culture. His temple, where where his people spent their time and their spiritual connection, has been destroyed, and the temple, the city walls have been destroyed with it. So that's where we're meeting in chapter 1. We see his mourning and his weeping. In 586, that is when Babylon takes over, and that's the fall of Jerusalem. In roughly 444, that's when Nehemiah is. 444, remember that memory hook? Before Jesus is where he is. Now, in 52 days, he actually gets a whole lot of work done when he finally gets there. In 52 days, they rebuild and resurrect the walls around Jerusalem. Not to freak you out or give you any trauma, do you know what happens in 52 days? We'll be celebrating Christmas. But, moving on to verse 5, which reminds us that he is fasting and he is mourning. He is fasting and mourning, and we looked at the focus of his prayer of that last week in chapter 1, where Nehemiah is confessing the sins of himself and for his people, and then he talks about God's generosity, God's grace. So I need to talk about that briefly. God's grace is his generosity. His generosity in that as far as people have walked away from him, as far as their hearts are gone, as much as they have ignored him, if they are to turn back to him, then they'll meet his generosity, they'll meet his grace, they'll meet his restoration, they'll be able to return to him and even rebuild. Even if they've gone to the farthest places where Nehemiah is. And that is a great message for us too, and it's a great gospel message. That however far you've walked from Jesus, or how much you've ignored Jesus, or how far away you've got from him, if you are to confess and turn to him, then you find forgiveness. You find the love of God, you find the gift of his Holy Spirit, and you find the hope of a future in heaven. Just like that thief who was next to him on the cross, who called out to Jesus. And so I've called this the God of Rebuilds. And so this series, and that's what the series is, because God wants to build into your life. He wants to actually rebuild the bits that are broken. And Nehemiah finds that, and that is why I've labelled that series this. So Nehemiah is Yahweh has comforted. These are his memoirs, and he has a job to do for the king of Persia. That's his role now. So in the end of chapter 1, we find out that he's a cupbearer. Very privileged job, but a very dangerous job, because if someone's assassinating the king, guess what? You drink the wine first before the king does, and you taste it. Dangerous because you've got to choose for him as well. If you make a wrong choice, you could lose your job, lose your head even. So that's Nehemiah's role that we find out. In chapter 2, where we are today, we find out that the king at the time is the Persian king. This is King Artaxerxes, from 460 to 420, basically is his reign. And then in Nehemiah, the book before, Ezra, the book before Nehemiah, you find out about a bit of the history. So you have King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who actually took them into exile, and then the Persians took over. So you hear about Cyrus as the one who allows them to go back to Jerusalem. And then there's other Persian kings, Artaxerxes and his dad Xerxes. Now, we had the HSC here during the week, and I did hear one of the kids' readers was reading a question, and one of them about the history, I think it was Artaxerxes. And I I thought, oh, cool. They're learning about history, actually. You can too, and you can catch up on those kings if you want. But what I want to do is look at Nehemiah, look at the king, and look at the gracious hand of God, particularly highlighting chapter 2, verse 8. If you have that open, you can look at that. We're going to have that read for us in a moment. But I wanted to quickly retell the story a little bit, because firstly we have a wine steward in Nehemiah, and we have the king in the king of Persia, who notices Nehemiah. Nehemiah is in deep sadness. Deep sadness has come upon him as he's heard about where his city is up to. He's heard about the state and the heart of the city, the heart of the people, really. He's also afraid. He's afraid, it says there, of the king's response when he's going to approach the king. And so he prays for favour and he prays for success before the king. So look out for that when we have that. That's Nehemiah. The king is actually has some emotional intelligence. He notices that the deep sadness that is in Nehemiah's heart. See, Nehemiah has the joy of the Lord is his strength. That's Nehemiah 8:10, the most famous verse in Nehemiah. The joy of the Lord is his strength, but the king actually notices there's something different about Nehemiah today. And he asks him about that, the king questions him about that. Why? And then the king asks, well, what do you want to do? And then the king asks, well, what do you need? And how long will you be? And so he's questioned by the king. Nehemiah then, his request is to return, rebuild, and can you resource me with this king? So it's a pretty bold, actually, confronting the king and asking of him. He is then granted passage to go back. Now, it's not just a walk in the park to get back, it's an actual full-on journey. If you're talking 900 kilometres where an airplane can fly there, this is walking in the ancient world or on a horseback. Nehemiah has free passage to go back. He asks the king to grant him that. And he has the access to the forest timbers of the king. Interesting there. But the gracious hand of God. The gracious hand of God. I'll just read verse 8 to you, and it says, and I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me the timbers to make beams for the gates of the citadel of the temple, and for the city walls, and for the residence that I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of God was upon me, the king granted my request. And so it goes on to say where he travelled through and where he got to. God is actually at work in this story. God's hand is at work on this man and in his life. God actually inclines the king's heart to be responsive to the request. Now, it doesn't make any political sense for the king to do this. It doesn't make any economic sense as he takes people and resources away to a far and distant land. And so we see that it's actually the divine hand of God. The fingerprints of God, the fingerprints of Yahweh are all over this story. Karen last week testified to this as she visited C3 last week, but she saw God's divine timing, God's divine doing, and God's divine appointment as she met people who was there and as she was there last Sunday. You can ask her about that story. But I want us to hear now the story of Nehemiah, so we're just going to, it'll be read to you, and you can close your eyes and listen along. Or you can follow along if you want, but I'm going to invite Margaret to read for us. And this is the story.
Good morning. This is an NIV version, and it's chapter 2, the first part. It's where King Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah to Jerusalem, so verses 1 to 10. In the month of Nishan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and I gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" So the king said to me, "What is it that you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favour in his sight, let me send him to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asher, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of God was upon me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites.
Thank you. Oh, hold off a bit. We'll do the next bit in a sec. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Let's go for that one. Excellent. Thank you, Margaret, recently retired Baptist Care. Let's think about, how's that story apply to us? How might we be connected to that? The first thing I want to encourage you to think about is prayer. Nehemiah 2:4, we see Nehemiah praying, and he actually prays before he speaks. A very wise thing to do, isn't it? If you've got an important discussion to have with someone, if you've got an important conversation to have, first speak to the King of Heaven. And so we see Nehemiah in chapter 1, we see him praying to the King of Kings before he speaks to the King on earth. I encourage you to do that. But I want to also encourage you to think about faith and having faith in these times, in those times. Nehemiah believes that God's hand is on the situation. God's hand equals God's plan. And he believes God is at work in this situation. It reminds me a little bit of Romans 8, where God is at work for the good of those who love him. Doesn't mean that he's going to grant every request, but he's for our good, and recognizing the gracious hand of God guiding things. Now, often you can see that in hindsight and in reflection. And we see here, as Nehemiah testifies, he believes him, he trusts him, he testifies to the hand of God and the work of God's hand upon his life. And I want to encourage you to share how God has had his hand upon your life as you look back or as you reflect on a situation. Just like Karen did with us last week, just like we see Nehemiah doing here now. But I want to move us to the second part of the story. And the second part of the story, we see Nehemiah's wall survey. Anyone into surveying here? Wall surveys, you think that's interesting? And we see the gracious hand of God. Nehemiah 2:18. But let me quickly retell you the story, because he's journeyed to Jerusalem. For Ezra, when he took people back, it took him, I think, 3 months as he travelled with all the entourage and as he travelled with the other resources and the supplies which he took. But when he gets there, he waits for 3 days. Why was he waiting 3 days? Maybe he was resting, it was a long journey. Maybe he was just taking survey of his place and his surroundings. And we do see him go and survey. He surveys in the night. Why does he survey in the night? Or maybe that he doesn't want to speak, reveal what he's doing. He takes a few men with him, and maybe that's why does he take a few men with him? Or maybe he's just actually influencing a few before he influences others. There's all these leadership lessons that you can have from Nehemiah. But as we read it, be thinking those things. He goes through the valley gate. Now, in Jerusalem, there is a valley. It's called the Kidron Valley, which is on the eastern side. And he goes out that gate, but he comes back in that gate. And in Nehemiah, he goes to different gates in different parts of the city. So follow that as we hear it. But we're in 444 BC. And the modern walls might be a little bit different. In 2018, I had the privilege of walking on the walls in Jerusalem, and I saw different vantage points. Some points are very high, as you can see there. That's a really high part. Some bits have been rebuilt on, as you can see the lower part there. And at different times, the walls have been broken and rebuilt. But he's called to rebuild. He has a positive response from the Jews, from the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the workers. Next week in chapter 3, we'll have a list of those people who worked on different parts of the wall. And he does have opposition. You may just notice it at the last verse that we had read first then. There's another verse in verse 19 where he meets more opposition. And in chapter 4, when we get there, we'll hear about the full opposition which he comes against. Now, Ruth is going to read the second half of the story.
Which is a photo of Eliana taken in preschool. So my reading comes to you with love. So this is chapter 2, verses 11 to 20. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 nights, set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you will have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it."
Thank you, Ruth. Just to finish off a couple of points of application, how this might apply to us. And firstly, I want to get you to think about your heart. The Lord puts it on Nehemiah's heart. Come, let us rebuild. And seek what the Lord is actually putting on your heart. Now that takes time. It takes time to discern that. It takes time to actually pray about that. You need others to help you see what God is actually putting upon your heart. But what ministry has he got for you? For Nehemiah, it was for the walls, but the walls were more than a physical thing. It was a spiritual reawakening of the hearts of the people there, what they were doing in Jerusalem. Is he calling you to persevere? Is he calling you to persevere against opposition? Is he calling you to a new thing in a distant land? Maybe for the first time or for another time. Is he calling you to your hometown to go back and to share there? Well, one of our mission partners will be coming home in 2026, and they'll be actually discerning what the Lord is putting on their heart, and they'll be spending the year doing that. But I want to encourage us to think about what exactly is the Lord putting upon your heart? What is he laying upon your heart? What is he laying upon my heart? And what is he laying upon our heart as a church family? Lastly, I want to finish to think about faith. And it takes us back to faith. Christianity is all about faith, and it is at the heart of Christianity. And here we see Nehemiah's faith, that it is God's hand upon him at work. He believes that this good work that he's been called to do is, they say, let us start this good work. Which kind of reminds me of the New Testament, and where God has prepared good works in advance for us to do, Ephesians 2. But in Philippians 1, it reminds us of the work that he has started in your life. When you've come to know him, when you come to follow Jesus, that he'll actually bring that on to completion as well. And you need to trust him with that. In 22 verse 20, we see that he believes that God will grant him success. Nehemiah believes, like the Apostle Peter, who stands there hundreds of years later in Jerusalem, and he says to the people, we must obey God, not man. When they've been put into prison, when they've been told not to do certain things, he says we must obey God. Interesting, at the time there was a Pharisee who believed as well. He believed enough to say that if this is the work of God, you can't stop it. You won't stop it. You'll actually find yourself fighting against God. It was the Pharisee Gamaliel, and you can look at that in Acts chapter 5. But just to finish, I want to encourage you to believe and have faith that God is at work. He is doing his work, and he is doing his work in our world, in the mess of this world, and in the mess of our lives. And we need to trust ourselves and be reminded of that. He divinely inspires the situation. You can't stop, human hands can't stop what God is doing. He has that work in his plans and his purposes, and we thank him and praise him for that. That is how we're going to finish, thanking and praising him. So I'll invite our musos up while we do that. So please pray with me as we finish our time together.